Years ago, I was taught that if we do not know our history, we will continue repeating the same mistakes that we've always made with expectations of different results. Unfortunately, it's very rare to get different results with the same activities. I like to teach and learn personally by analogies. During my lifetime, one of the things that has really impressed me is our history and our ability to recall. And a lot of our history here in Kansas, as well as across the United States, and I'm sure probably in Canada, it is full of Masons. And if we do not have contemporary historians that can record that history, it generally is lost to oblivion, or in the alternative, obscured in such a way that is not really accurate. I can recall in school being required to learn the poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. It was the 18th of April of '75, and hardly a man is now alive that remembers that famous day and year. One if by land, two if by sea, I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm to every Middlesex village and farm. That particular poem was written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow many years after that ride, but it was still within his lifetime, and that's what he's talking about. Hardly a man is now alive. And if it were not for that poem, many Americans probably would think of Paul Revere as the guy that invented the frying pan, the Revereware. Although he was a silversmith, he was a lot more than that. During my lifetime, there are a lot of memorable events. How many of you can remember where you were the day that Kennedy was assassinated? Bingo. We've got men here that can remember that. If you can remember that, you probably also can remember such things as the Berlin Wall coming down. I can remember the little blue bubble gum in the late 1950s that was rough as a cob, Sputnik, commemorative of the Russian spaceship that went up. Along those lines, I didn't realize it at the time. Not only have Masons been notorious for borrowing, so has our country. I didn't realize that the space program that Kennedy promoted, when he talked about the United States will put a man on the moon, and I remember hearing that speech, by the end of this decade. But I did not know that we borrowed that space program from Tito in Yugoslavia. In doing my research, I learned that Yugoslavia was not that far behind Russia, but they didn't have the resources to move forward, so they sold it to the United States. Unbelievable in your history if you do your research. I can remember where I was when I watched in awe when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, a Mason, stepped foot on the moon, July of 1969. The point that I'm making is that during my lifetime, I can go back and I can remember specific events that were important, significant, and historical. I think Darren was a little bit overzealous when he was talking about my huge Masonic library. I do have dozens, if not hundreds of books that are Masonic in nature, and I do spend a significant amount of time, I have a bad memory, so I have to go back and reread them. A significant amount of time reading and rereading those books, trying to keep abreast of my Masonic history. In any event, In my Masonic travels, when I come across a book that I haven't seen before, it's not unusual for me to pick it up and look at it, and if it's something of interest to me, I latch on to it. I would assume there's no one here from Colorado because that particular jurisdiction utilizes the Rocky Mountain Conference for their education and their Masonic purposes. But having attended the Grand Lodge of Colorado numerous times, one of the things I always look forward to is going through their used book pile. They literally, from their library, purge a few books every year that they've got multiple copies of. It's a way of benefiting their financial coffers, if you will, but also getting books back into circulation that perhaps have not been seen or read for years. And several years ago, while I was in Colorado, I picked up this little book. I thought it was a little bit pricey. It was 30 bucks. But I looked at it, and it was called Masonic Light on the Abduction and Murder of William Morgan by P.C. Huntington. Have any of you read this book? I picked up the book, didn't read it for several years. I was aware, or thought that I was aware, of the William Morgan affair, which in my estimation is a little bit like the Apollo 13 of the 19th century. Houston, we have a problem. And I want to share a little bit of that with you today. I'm not very techy. It looks like I just lost everything. Oh, there we go. There we go. It's not uncommon for us to be able to recall or reconstruct events that have occurred during our lifetime, depending upon our age, 40, 50, 60 years ago. As I was discussing earlier, I can recall when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and of course the Apollo 13 explosion, which happened to occur on the 13th day of April of 1970, was probably one of the greatest and shining events of our NASA history. And JFK was assassinated in '63. The story about Nixon resigning, it's amazing to me. It's how you recall and associate. I was in South Dakota in August of '74 attending there were two brothers getting married, attending a wedding in South Dakota. And then 2 days later drove to Illinois for the other brother's wedding. And the ironic thing is, when the first one got married, Nixon was the president. When the second one got married, Gerald Ford was the president. Can you imagine that happening? Two brothers getting married 2 days apart. Who would think that they had different presidents during that time of their lives? That's how it's easy for me to remember that. And then not only have our NASA and space explorations been successful, there have been some tragedies, such as the Challenger or the Columbia. In any event, I believe that it's important that we know our history. And one of the things that impressed me about this little book was written, this particular book was written in the 1880s, and this book was published in 1886. And I treat it like it was published 20 years ago. I throw it around, I rummage through it, I throw it around some more. It's been a damn good book. The story of the Apollo 13, much like the poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, was memorialized a few years later, and it helped embed it in the memories of those that lived after that. In the terms of Apollo 13, there was a movie made several years later about that event, which, as I understand, was reasonably accurate, and I think will literally go down in history as embedding it in the memories of ourselves and our children and our grandchildren of those events that took place. And since that time, the term or the phrase, Houston, we've got a problem, generally is something that we as Americans, and I suppose our brothers in Canada at least have heard of or can relate to. When you hear that, it generally is a little bit like the Masonic plea for help, because we had 3 astronauts hundreds of thousands of miles away from home in a very dire situation, fully expecting to land and spend some time on the moon, and they were running out of oxygen fast. They were running out of everything fast. And through the American ingenuity, they moved out of the basic main spaceship into the moon lunar lander and survived the next several days. Used what little power was in that lunar lander that was supposed to have gotten them down to the moon and back for the power to slingshot around the moon. And at that time, the American astronaut with the most experience, James Lovell, happened to be at the helm. And it just gives me goosebumps every time I watch that movie, what James Lovell and the astronauts here on Earth were able to do over the next several days to take a dire, almost impossible situation and turn it into a success, to where they were only 4 minutes late from the projected landing when they came back, and it landed within 2 miles of the recovered ship. They landed early because they should have stayed at the moon. They were light because they didn't have the moon rocks. All of the various variables that went into that is unbelievable. But it's something that I can remember, and that movie helped me realize that. As part of this presentation, I went through a lot of my books, and at the end of this, I've got a short bibliography that will show what I was referring to in some of my research for the paper this morning. In any event, Allan Roberts is one of my favorite Masonic authors, having 25, 26 books, numerous movies and videos and things that he put together. I just regret that although I was a Mason, I was never able to meet him or attend a conference or someplace where he was there, because to me, he would have been Mr. Mason. In any event, getting ready for this presentation, I have made some notes as it relates to Roberts. And if you notice up at the top, I'm showing 19th century William Morgan, aka Mustafa, in Smyrna, Asia Minor. Allan Roberts claims that Morgan was born in 74. He married a lady by the name of Lucinda. Ended up in Batavia, New York, by way of Canada. Was a brick mason. Passed himself off over the years as a mason. And once he was at Batavia, was a part of effort to petition to form a chapter, Royal Arts. He partnered when he was somehow rather dropped from the petition and fell out of favor with the local Masons. He decided he was going to show them. He was just going to have an expose of Masonry in between his serious drinking problem. According to Roberts and many other authors, it appears as though that he was well known to Masonic charity, and he and his wife took advantage of that numerous times. In any event, the Masons, or someone, in September, started a fire at the printing office. Back in those days, you could be arrested for bad debts, and he was someone bailed him out and helped him into a carriage, and within about 7 days, he disappeared forever. In any event, it started what I would generally call Houston, we have a problem, because that was just the thing that was needed by the anti-Masonic feeling at that time. If you're familiar with her history, you will be aware that in 1820, Monroe, who happened to be a Mason, was ushered into office, what we call an era of good feeling. Things were just really smooth in the country at that time. But down below the surface, there was a little bit of bubbling and boiling. Part of it was by the clergy and those that they had influence over. Those damn Masons were controlling everything. And ultimately, it was not uncommon for sheriffs. Can you imagine that in Kansas, having some sheriffs at the Masons? It's Cole Preston, our grandmaster, and judges and prosecutors, such as Mike Allan, master last night, I'm a former prosecutor. And that bothered some of the people. And in any event, there was a terrific anti-Masonic sentiment. And with a little bit of help from people like Thurlow Weed, and of course this David Miller, they were able to foment some anti-Masonic sentiment, and in an effort to try to control that tide, past Grad Bastard, Governor DeWitt Clinton from New York, where this was, shortly after the disappearance and alleged abduction and murder, took it upon himself to begin to have a reward raised to show that it was important that crimes do not go unsolved, and that we try to reward those that assist in solving those crimes. But despite that, as you can tell, numerous grand juries were convened over the next 5 years. There were some individuals who fessed up or were convicted of conspiracy to kidnap. It seems as though that Morgan was removed from Batavia to Fort Niagara, which was, as I understand, about 100 miles away, which would have taken a considerable length of time to get there in a, let's say, a stagecoach, some sort of a covered carriage. In any event, it was documented at the time that Morgan remained there until 7 days later, and on the 19th, he was gone forever. The allegations were that the Masons threw him into the river, the lakes, wherever, drowned him, or that they sent him to Canada and supported him, got him out of the way. But it doesn't seem as though there was a lot of documentation in it. And until I read this book, I didn't realize that there was some contemporary documentation of what had happened. About a year later, there was a body discovered in Lake Ontario. And of course, there was some very quick false news or jumped conclusions that, hey, we found him, and they buried him, and he was then exhumed a couple of times. There's Thurlow Weed as a part of one of those, just before the inquest, having realized that this guy that was found with the bushy hair and the long beard didn't quite match up with the bald guy without the beard. So it seems as though before the coroner conducted the second inquest, that hair was shaved and disappeared. And it was then determined that maybe that was Morgan. And at a short time after that, a Canadian woman came forward and identified the fellow as her husband. He was wearing the same clothes. As far as the state of the body was concerned, been in the water for about a month. It would be consistent. Not that they had CSI or forensics back in those days, but they were able to tell if he'd been in the water for over a year, as Morgan would have been, there would have been much left. In any event, when it was determined that the actual individual found was named Monroe, Thurlow Weed was quoted as having said, well, the corpse would be good enough Morgan until after the election. There was significant public outrage, and Houston, we did have a problem. In the state of New York, as you can see, in 1927, there were 20,000 Masons, and by 1930, they were down to 3. What would your jurisdiction do if you had about an 80–85% hit on your Masonic population? The actual number of lodges dropped from 480 down to 82. In Vermont, they literally shut down the whole Grand Lodge and Masonic system. And in fact, in the later election of 1832, the anti-Masonic party carried the state of Vermont on the presidential election. In Maine, they went from having 30 lodges attending their annual communication in 1830 down to 1 lodge by 1837. However, by 1844, it began to revive, and things improved after that. But the point being, there was significant problems. Is there any representative here today from Michigan? I understood maybe it wasn't. There you go. Let me ask you a quick question. Does Stony Creek Lodge still exist?
Yes, it does. It's in Rochester, Michigan. My name is Craig Mason, Junior Warden of the Grand Lodge. And it exists, and it was the last one to hold a candle in its window. All the lodges at that time disappeared like off the face of the earth in Michigan. We had only one lodge that kept the light on, and that was Stony Creek number 5.
Daniel B. Taylor was the Michigan hero. Just as the brother indicated, from approximately 1829 till 1840, according to Allan Roberts, this fellow named Daniel Taylor continued to faithfully go to his lodge despite the fact that the Grand Lodge suspended all activities. That brother Mason, who was the Tyler, every lodge night would go to lodge, according to Allan Roberts, light a candle and put it in the window of the Masonic Lodge. Every meeting night. Occasionally, the brother might come along, otherwise he would just read or spend some time there. Until the end of what would normally be a meeting, he would snuff out the candle and go home. Talk about a love of the fraternity. Daniel B. Taylor of Michigan was living. I personally have always been a fan of Andrew Jackson. He kind of ran counter or contrary to a lot of things. And despite the anti-Masonic movement, having been a pastor at Master of Tennessee, won presidential election in 28 and again in 32. He lost in 24. So he geared up early for the 28 election that he won, and he served 8 years as our president. And at least for a little while longer, his face will grace the $20 bill. As I understand, under the Obama administration a few years ago, the Department of Treasury made some changes, and there will be a woman replacing him on the $20 bill at some point in the near future. In any event, during that time, there were strong Masons who were leaders who refused to bow to that activity. According to Allan Roberts, in the South, the anti-Masonic activity was not quite as active. Of course, the internet wasn't as good in those days, and the cable TV news and stuff didn't get down there. And during this general time frame, the Grand Lodge of Florida was formed and recognized as a Grand Lodge, and there was also one in Texas. The question becomes, what actually happened to Morgan. They never found the body. According to Huntington, and this book was written, the volume that I've got, in 1886, which would be roughly about 60 years after the event. And if you think back 60 years in our contemporary times, and we think in terms of, and there's probably some of you in the crowd also, remember Khrushchev banging his shoe on the podium at the United Nations? Most people don't think much about that. But that was, to me, a very historical and memorable event when he was contesting or literally obsessed with the Filipino accusation about Russia in Eastern Europe. But there are little things that happen in our lives that we think of and we remember. And this book was written at a time where there were still people alive that remembered the Morgan affair, and they claimed, according to Huntington, there were no less than I believe it was 8 different sources of individuals that he quotes in this book. In the volume that I've got, it's a second printing. It leads me to believe that the actual initial printing was about 5 or 6 years earlier, and after that came out, he was then flooded with this information by people that said, hey, wait a minute, did you know? Have you heard? Which prompted him then to add the last 2 chapters to this particular book. And in that volume, it talks in terms of, and in those days, we didn't have United Airlines and some of those things to zip around the world. The primary means of transportation would have been by ship. And those individuals who were the captains of those ships carried with them an awe, an aura, and authority and leadership that was second to none. And 2 or 3 of these individuals who are quoted in this book as being first-person contemporary historians indicated that they ran across an individual named, who called himself Mustafa, who was operating out of the British consul in Asia Minor, and that he landed there shortly after the events of the Batavia kidnapping with a mere $4,000 in his pocket. Today, you could probably get by a little while on $4,000. Back in those days, that should have been enough to have lasted him a lifetime. And in this particular book, it recites or relates the fact that numerous times there were American ships that landed there, and he, as a former American or an American that spoke good English, approached many of them attempting to sell them bread or other supplies that you might need on the ship. In a lot of cases, no one suspected who he was or what it was all about, but over a period of about 50 years, there were many, many counts, and I believe in this book it relates at least 8 of those, and the author indicated, what more do you need? And if you think about it, I believe that when I petitioned to become a Mason, I had to have a couple of recommenders, I had to have some references and stuff. I didn't have to have 8 in order to document who I was for my reputation, but in this book, okay, Darren, how do I get over to my document? William Morgan's file. What I have done, brothers, is literally copied about 10, 12 pages out of the book. So I want you to know, that my reputation reputation is easily tarnished, and I'm not making this up, so I'm going to show you this in that last chapter. And Darren, there you go, Darren's pulling it up now. There we go. There we go. What became of Morgan? Of course, Thurlow Weed, the individual who thought that the body of Monroe was good enough for Morgan until the next election. At the time of his death, he became quite famous and wealthy. That's the conclusion of the former chapter. I guess we'll go this way. This is the beginning of over on the right-hand side, a letter by a ship's captain, and toward the end of this letter, on the following pages, it recites the fact that he's not a Mason. So it's not like as if he got some self-aggrandizement, but that he. Are you doing that or am I? Super, super, super. Yeah, he indicated that on a trip to Smyrna, that he ran across this fellow, and it wasn't until he talked to that other individual he later realized that that in fact was actually William Morgan. And the book relates story after story with indications in there that there are those individuals who certainly would be willing to give sworn testimony to this effect. And the story that Huntington weaves appears to be significantly convincing. And I know as a brother Mason, I had never even heard of William Morgan the first several years that I was a Mason. It's not one of those things that we talk about to our younger brothers. I don't know whether he's in the room here or not. I heard some discussion with the color guard. Harry was introducing one of the fellows to someone else, and he said he's our youngest master Mason. He's only been a Mason for a month. I'm sure that a lot of our brothers have never heard of William Morgan, and those of us that do eventually hear of him, kind of left hanging at whatever happened to this guy. I never did find the body, and it wasn't until I read this contemporary book, I call it contemporary, it was written in the 1880s, but it was within about 60 years, less than 60 years of the event, that it appears to be rather well documented. What is interesting to me as individuals, Masonic scholars such as Allan Roberts, never mentioned it in his book, The American History, but nonetheless, it appears as though that it's there. Move on down, Darren. There's more about that. This was literally signed off on in 1875 and was included in this book in 1886 by a fellow who was a captain. And there are continuing stories similarly, and a lot of these stories are relating to events that took place in the 1830s and 1831 of sightings of this individual who everyone is saying was in fact Morgan, and they are documenting this within 40 to 50 years after having seen him. If you notice over in the lower right hand side there, it says that he was protected by the British consul who obtained for him a position in the custom house, which enabled him to wear the Oriental dress without molestation, because he was dressed as a Turk. That's one of the things that surprised the Americans. Here's this Turkish-looking fellow, and he would come up to them talking perfect, what appeared to be perfect American English. And it was very suspecting. And it was later documented that that's how it came to be, and due to the fact that he was involved with somehow or other the British consul, and they allowed him to wear the Oriental dress. So as far as the local people were concerned, he was acceptable and would bother him. And of course, as American man of war ships and things would arrive there for trading, etc., he would have contact with the reverends. As you pass on, on the left-hand side, there's a reference to the chaplain, the frigate Brandywine. Makes a reference to the fact that he saw fellow William Morgan. The book appears to have been written contemporaneously and to have some authentic support. If you continue along, Darren, you'll see a little bit more there. That he went by the name of Mustafa for whatever reason. He appeared to have lived there alone in the city. There's some allegations that he might have been harassed enough or bothered enough that maybe he left Asia Minor. Others suspect that maybe he died there and was buried alive. And no one knows for sure what ultimately happened to Mustafa, whether he was Morgan or not. But there certainly appears to be some allegations that would explain why he wasn't seen so much in later years. Over on the right-hand side, of course, as you're probably well aware, and even today on the internet or books, you can find about anything you want to know about Masonry. There was reference to the fact that maybe there was some plagiarism, or the fact that books called Chocolate and Boaz had been published previously for years, so whatever he was attempting to publish wasn't necessarily all that earth-shattering at the time. It's just that it was earth-shattering to someone who had never seen the books before. Continuing on there, we're getting close to the end of it. There is the end of it. Basically saying for roughly about 50 years, half of a century, and I'm going to use the current terminology, false news or whatever, there was anti-Masonic press and stuff, but Roberts and other individuals, I think my big daughter got lost in there, what was on the original. By about 1840 to 1845, up until that time, the Masonic lodges in New York, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, were faced with some unmerciful anti-Masonic type of, types of press. And we really have to take our hats off to the Daniel Taylors of Michigan and other locations who were steadfast to their obligations and take it from there. In any event, what I wanted to do this morning was to share a little bit of history, not necessarily Candace Masonic history, but of our fraternity. I hope that my presentation was educational. I hope that if you were not that familiar with Morgan, at least it shows some alternatives or some possible explanations of whatever happened to him, and despite of whatever did happen to him, the fraternity became stronger as a result of that. And it reminds me of one of the tail ends portions of the movie Apollo 13, when the news media talked to one of the individuals who was the head of the Houston recovery, talking in terms of it being the darkest hour in American history, and it just made my goosebumps come up on my body when the individual there responded and said, oh no, this wasn't the darkest hour, this was our greatest hour. We in fact brought back 3 Americans alive, and there's nothing greater than that. In our particular case, many, many years now after the Morgan affair, if someone happens to mention it to you, at least maybe you've got a little bit more information, hopefully, than you had previously about what various writers, authors, and historians have thought in terms of what ultimately happened to him. And God bless Andrew Jackson. Thank you.